night over the Deeping Combe did not fall. It collapsed, heavy with the scent of ozone, wet wool, and cold stone. Through the driving rain, a sound began to rise, distinct from the thunder rolling off the peaks of the Ered Nimrais. It was a rhythmic, grinding percussion. Iron on rock, 10,000 heavy boots hitting the earth in perfect, terrifying unison. On the ramparts of the Hornburg, the grip of the Rohirrim tightened on slick spear shafts. These were not the proud Eords of old riding to glory in the sun. These were the remnants of a kingdom pushed to the brink. Farmers, herdsmen, boys too young to shave, and men too old to stand straight. They looked out into the blackness and saw the torchlight of Isengard spreading across the valley floor like a slow-moving lava flow. Saruman the White had not sent this legion merely to conquer. He had sent them to erase. This was not a raiding party seeking plunder. It was an industrial machine of war, bred in the pits of Orthanc for a single purpose: the absolute negation of the Horse Lords. The sheer density of the enemy formation turned the valley into a sea of pike and armor, a wall of iron pressing against a wall of stone. Here, in this narrow throat of the mountains, the fate of the West would not be decided by diplomacy or ancient wisdom, but by the breaking of shields and the shattering of rock. Before the sun rises, the world as they know it must be dismantled so that a new one might survive. This was the Battle of the Hornburg. To understand the sheer hopelessness of the defense, one must first understand the geometry of the battlefield. The Hornburg was not merely a castle. It was a stopper in a bottle. Built by the men of Gondor in the days of their zenith, it utilized the sheer rock of the Trihern Mountain to create a natural choke point. The fortress itself sat upon a spur of rock, dominating the valley, while the Deeping Wall, 20 feet high and thick enough for 4 men to walk abreast, stretched across the valley floor, effectively sealing the pass. In traditional warfare, this is a commander's dream. It forces the enemy to narrow their front, negating the advantage of numbers. But Theoden King was not fighting a traditional war, and he was not fighting a traditional enemy. Strategically, the Rohirrim were fighting against their own nature. They are a people of the open plain, masters of maneuver, shock, and velocity. Their entire military doctrine relies on the charge, the ability to flank, to retreat, and to strike again. By retreating into the Hornburg, Theoden had voluntarily caged his greatest asset. He had dismounted his knights and placed them behind stone, trading mobility for durability. It was a calculated gamble, born of necessity after the disaster at the fords of Isen, but it stripped the Horse Lords of their primary tactical advantage. Inside the walls, the logistical situation was grim. The force was comprised of roughly 2,000 men. A fraction of these were the professional soldiery of the royal household, Hammer's Guard, and the heavy infantry of the Westfold. The rest were a levy en masse, a hasty conscription of the local populace. Farmers armed with wood axes, herdsmen with light hunting bows, and old men clutching rusted swords from forgotten feuds. They were provisions, not warriors. They had food to last a siege, but they lacked the heavy ordnance to break one. Opposing them was a force that represented a revolution in military affairs. Saruman had not simply gathered a horde of orcs. He had industrialized the production infantry. The Uruk-hai were larger, stronger, and more disciplined than the mountain goblins of the north. They were equipped with standardized, heavy armor, broad-bladed swords, and long pikes specifically designed to impale charging horses. But the true danger lay in the composition of the Isengard forces. It was a combined arms assault. At the vanguard were the Dunlendings, wild hillmen driven by an ancient blood feud against the Strawheads of Rohan. They were the psychological weapon, screaming for vengeance, willing to die to breach the gates. Behind them marched the solid blocks of Uruk infantry, the grinding weight of the army. And hidden within their ranks was Saruman's devilry. In the history of Middle-earth, sieges were matters of attrition or escalade, ladders, battering rams, and starvation. But Saruman brought engineering to the battlefield. He had analyzed the deeping wall and found the one flaw in the Gondorian design: the culvert. The deeping stream, a swift flowing torrent of cold water, ran beneath the wall through a small grate to prevent the fortress from flooding. To a medieval tactician, this was a necessary utility. To the industrial mind of Saruman, it was a structural void. He did not intend to go over the wall. He intended to go through it. The intent of the enemy commander was clear. There would be no parley, no demand for surrender. The logistical goal of Isengard was total eradication. Saruman needed Rohan removed from the board entirely, so that his forces could link with Sauron's in the east without a threat to his rear. This meant that for the defenders, the tactical objective was binary: hold until sunrise or face extinction. Theoden had Eomer, his marshal, and Aragorn, the heir of kings, at his side. He had the strength of the three hunters. But as the torches filled the valley from wall to wall, revealing a forest of pikes and ladders, the strategic reality set in. The Rohirrim were trapped in a stone box, and the enemy had brought a sledgehammer. The wall, their only salvation, would soon become the instrument of their greatest trial. The battle did not begin with a roar, but with a sudden suffocating darkness. The storm clouds finally smothered the moon, plunging the valley into an abyssal gloom, broken only by the jagged arcs of lightning hitting the peaks. And then the arrows came, a steel rain, hissing through the downpour, rattling against the battlements like hail. The first assault was brute force calculation. The Dunlendings and Uruks surged forward, not as individuals, but as a singular climbing organism. They threw ladders up against the deeping wall, with suicidal disregard for the rocks and spears cast down upon them. It was a chaotic, vertical scrum. Along the parapet, Aragorn and Eomer, the ranger and the marshal, moved like reapers. Swords flashed in the lightning, Anduril and Guthwine rising and falling in a rhythm of grim necessity. But for every ladder toppled, 3 more took its place. The sheer biomass of Isengard was overwhelming the defenders' capacity to kill. Down at the main gates, the enemy brought up the battering rams, great tree trunks shod in iron, swung by trolls and giant orcs. The boom of wood against the master gates echoed through the keep, a heartbeat of doom. It was here that the defenders first seized the initiative. Aragorn and Eomer, realizing the gates were buckling, did not wait for them to break. They utilized the postern door, a small side exit, and led a sortie. It was a maneuver of pure shock. They cut their way through the press, hewing at the ram bearers, buying precious time with sudden violence before retreating back into the safety of the stone. But Saruman had anticipated heroism. He knew that courage could hold a wall, but physics could bring it down. While the attention of the defense was fixed on the gates and the ladders, a small team of Uruks crept into the culvert of the deeping stream. They carried no swords, only casks of black powder, the fire of Orthanc. The explosion that followed ripped the night apart. This was not merely a breach, it was a paradigm shift. The Rohirrim, a people whose understanding of war was defined by the clash of steel and the thunder of hooves, was suddenly confronted with chemical warfare. The deeping wall, which had stood for centuries, simply ceased to exist. Stones the size of ox carts tossed into the air like pebbles. The strategic choke point was gone. The stopper had been blown out of the bottle. The theme of the battle shifted instantly from defense to survival. The Uruks poured through the gaping wound in the defenses, a black tide washing over the defenders. The retreat was desperate. The Rohirrim were forced back from the wall, fighting step by bloody step, abandoning the outer defenses to take shelter in the glittering caves and the keep of the Hornburg itself. It was the darkest hour. Hammer, the captain of the king's guard, lay dead before the gates, hewn down. The defenders were split. Yoma and his men were cut off, forced to fight a retreating action back into the narrows leading to the caves. Theoden and Aragorn were sealed inside the burg, trapped in the high tower. From a military standpoint, the battle was lost. The perimeter was compromised, the defenders were divided, and the enemy controlled the field. The logical course of action was to barricade the doors and wait for the end. But as the long night dragged toward morning, a strange alchemy took place in the mind of the king. Trapped in his stone cage, hearing the wolves of Isengard scratching at the door, Theoden shed the weight of his despair. He realized that if they were to die, they would not die cowering. They would die doing the one thing the Rohirrim were born to do. They would ride. It was a decision of tactical insanity, but psychological brilliance. As the eastern sky began to turn a bruised grey, the great horn of Helm Hammerhand was sounded. The blast was so profound, it seemed to shake the tower itself, momentarily stunning the Uruk hordes with the superstitious terror that the ancient king had returned from the dead. The gates of the keep were thrown open. Theoden King, Aragorn, and the last of the household guard rode out. They did not ride to escape. They rode to destroy. They plunged into the sea of Uruks like a spear thrust. The sheer kinetic energy of the charge, fueled by the fatalistic joy of men who have accepted their own deaths, shattered the front ranks of the besiegers. They drove a wedge through the enemy, pushing them off the causeway, hacking a path toward the dike. Simultaneously, the sun crested the hills, and with the light came the second hammer blow. On the ridge of the valley, a figure appeared in white, shining so explicitly against the rising sun that he hurt the eyes. Gandalf. And behind him, not the elves of legend, but Erkenbrand of Westfold, the master of the Hornburg, and 1,000 infantrymen he had rallied from the rout at the fords of Isen. The strategic picture flipped in an instant. The Uruks were sandwiched. To their front, the berserker charge of the king. To their rear, the fresh steel of Erkenbrand's shield wall charging down the slope. But the final checkmate was not delivered by men. As the Uruks broke and fled toward the mouth of the valley, their only escape route, they ran into a wall of silence. During the night, a forest had moved. The horns of Fangorn, ancient semi-sentient trees, roused to anger, had blocked the exit. The machine of Isengard, the industrial destroyers of trees, fled blindly into the dark canopy of the wood. They did not come out. The sun rose fully over the deeping coombe. The rain had stopped. The noise of battle was replaced by a strange stillness. The invincibility of Isengard had been broken, not by superior numbers, but by the synchronization of a suicidal counterattack and a perfectly timed reinforcement. The destruction of the wall had forced the Rohirrim into the corner where they found their salvation. The silence that settled over the deeping coombe in the hours after dawn was not a peace. It was a stunned exhaustion. The strange, brooding forest of Huorns that had swallowed the retreating Uruks vanished as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind no bodies, only trampled earth and a lingering sense of ancient malice satisfied. The valley floor was a ruin. The great deeping wall, the pride of Gondorian engineering, lay in rubble, a broken tooth in the mouth of the valley. But amidst the wreckage, the true cost of salvation became clear. The victory was absolute, yet it was bought with the currency of total devastation. The Death Down, the great mound where the Rohirrim piled the carcasses of the Uruk-hai, would stand for generations. A hill of stone and bone where the grass grew greener and taller than anywhere else, fed by the blood of the industrialized dark. No beast would graze there. It was a scar on the land, a permanent reminder that the new order of Saruman had been halted not by negotiation, but by slaughter. Strategically, the Battle of the Hornburg was the turning point of the War of the Ring in the West. Saruman had committed a classic blunder. He had emptied his fortress to destroy his enemy, leaving his own center of gravity, Orthanc, undefended against the Ents. By seeking total annihilation, he invited his own. The destruction of his army at Helm's Deep did not just save Rohan, it unlocked the strategic mobility of the Horse Lords. Had the Hornburg fallen, the Rohirrim would have been erased. Gondor to the east would have faced the assault of Mordor without allies, flanked by a victorious Saruman. The White City would have fallen before the Ringbearer ever reached Mount Doom. Thus, the breaking of the Deeping Wall was, paradoxically, the salvation of the Free Peoples. It forced the Rohirrim out of their defensive crouch and back into the open war, where they could affect the wider geopolitical landscape. The lesson of Helm's Deep is a harsh one. It teaches that safety is an illusion. The wall you build to protect yourself can become your tomb. True survival required the destruction of that safety, the blowing of the wall, the opening of the gates, the ride into death. Theoden King rode out of that valley a different man. He was no longer the bewitched dotard sitting in the shadows of Meduseld. He was a war king, forged anew in the fires of the Hornburg. The road to the Pelennor fields, to the final defense of Minas Tirith, began here, in the mud and ruin of the deep. The map had indeed been redrawn. The boundaries between the world of men and the ancient tree-waking magic of the world had blurred. The kine of Arra would graze again in the Westfold, but the shadow had only been pushed back, not extinguished. The victory at Helm's Deep proved that the West still had the will to fight, but it also proved that to defeat the machinery of the enemy, one must be willing to break the very things one holds most dear. The wall is down. The war has truly begun.